To the modern observer, the alliance between Great Britain and the United States seems inevitable, a natural alignment of language, culture, and democratic values, often hailed as the special relationship. Yet, history tells a different, far more volatile story. For the majority of the 19th century, London and Washington were not partners. They were deeply suspicious rivals, locked in a transatlantic Cold War that constantly threatened to turn hot. The peace that held for a century was not preordained. It was a fragile construct, built upon the smoking ruins of the War of 1812, a conflict that ended in a treaty but left a festering psychological wound across the English Atlantic. To understand how these two great powers avoided a third cataclysmic war, one must first understand the lingering shadow of the second one. For the young American Republic, the War of 1812 became mythologized as a second war of independence. Despite the burning of their capital and the blockade of their ports, Americans emerged from the conflict with a surging sense of nationalism. They had stood toe-to-toe with the mightiest empire on earth and survived. This survival bred a new generation of American politicians and voters who were hypersensitive to any perceived slight from the old colonial master. They were eager to assert their sovereignty, often loudly and aggressively, creating a political climate where twisting the British lion's tail was a guaranteed vote winner. However, across the ocean, in the halls of Westminster and the officers' messes of the British Army, the memory of 1812 was far darker and more resentful. To the British establishment, the American declaration of war in 1812 had not been a noble fight for maritime rights. It was viewed as an act of supreme and cowardly opportunism. The United States had chosen to attack Canada at the precise moment Britain was fighting for its very survival against the tyranny of Napoleonic France. In the eyes of British veterans who had bled at Waterloo and in the Peninsula, the Americans had attempted to stab Britain in the back while her shield was raised against a continental despot. This sense of betrayal lingered long after the Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1815. It coloured every diplomatic interaction for the next 4 decades. The British elite viewed the Americans not as cousins, but as unpredictable, land-hungry upstarts who could not be trusted to keep their word. This mutual animosity was most palpable along the vast, rugged frontier that separated the United States from British North America, what we now know as Canada. The border was a jagged scar running through the wilderness, a flashpoint where the friction between the two nations was physically felt. The Great Lakes, in particular, remained a theatre of anxiety. In the immediate aftermath of the war, both sides engaged in a frantic shipbuilding race, laying down keels for warships destined to dominate these inland seas. It was a destabilizing arms race in the heart of the continent. Sanity momentarily prevailed with the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817, a landmark agreement that demilitarized the Great Lakes and strictly limited the naval tonnage allowed on the water. It was the first modern disarmament treaty, a radical experiment in trust between two nations that had none. Yet, a treaty on paper could not erase the tension on the ground. The border remained porous and wild, a haven for smugglers, deserters, and political agitators. British garrisons in Canada remained on high alert, watching the southern horizon with suspicion. Every movement of American militia, every thunderous speech in the US Congress calling for expansion, sent ripples of alarm through the Governor-General's residence in Quebec and back to the Colonial Office in London. The British strategic reality was grim. While the Royal Navy ruled the waves, Canada was a hostage to geography. If war came, the massive, growing population of the United States could theoretically overwhelm the thin, red line of British defenders before reinforcements could ever cross the Atlantic. Thus, the decades following 1815 were not an era of peace, but an era of calculated standoff. It was a time when localized brawls over timber, obscure borderlines, or maritime rights could spiral out of control before diplomats in London or Washington even knew a crisis had begun. The special relationship was a distant dream, The reality was two pugilists circling each other in a ring that spanned a continent, waiting for the bell to ring for round 3. The stage was set not for friendship, but for a series of diplomatic duels where the margin between peace and war was measured in inches and often depended on the temperament of men who despised one another. As the 19th century marched toward its midway point, the friction along the border sparked into a series of bizarre and dangerous crises, each threatening to ignite the powder keg of a third Anglo-American war. The first of these near misses occurred in the frozen, timber-rich wilderness between the state of Maine and the British province of New Brunswick. By the winter of 1839, a dispute over the imprecise border lines drawn decades earlier descended into a conflict known as the Aroostook War. It began not with armies, but with lumberjacks. American and Canadian loggers, wielding axes and fueled by nationalistic pride, clashed over valuable timber stands, leading to fistfights that rapidly escalated into militia call-ups. The United States Congress authorized 50,000 men for war. Britain prepared to defend its colonial supply lines. Yet, just as the first shots seemed inevitable, the crisis was diffused by two unlikely statesmen who chose collusion over conflict. The American Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, and the British Special Envoy, Lord Ashburton, met in Washington in 1842. Unlike the typical adversaries of the era, Webster and Ashburton were personal friends, banking associates who understood that peace was more profitable than pine trees. In a remarkable display of diplomatic sleight of hand, both men suppressed maps in their possession that supported the opposing side's claim. They effectively cooked the books, hiding evidence that might have inflamed their respective publics to carve out a compromise. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty redrew the map, ignoring the jingoistic cries from both Maine and New Brunswick, and proving that personal diplomacy could override national hysteria. Hardly had the ink dried in the east when the war drums began beating in the west. The vast, rain-soaked wilderness of the Oregon Country became the obsession of American expansionists. By 1844, the slogan, 54-40 or fight, echoed through Washington, a demand for the British to cede the entire Pacific Northwest up to the boundary of Russian Alaska. This was a direct challenge to Britain's Hudson's Bay Company, which had long operated in the region. The British government, unwilling to be bullied, quietly moved warships into the Pacific, preparing to defend the Columbia River. War seemed imminent, yet the catalyst for peace came from an unexpected source: the British stomach. In London, the government was in the throes of repealing the Corn Laws, dismantling tariffs to allow cheap grain imports to feed a hungry industrial populace. The political calculus shifted overnight. The British elite realized they preferred American wheat to American territory. Free trade politicians argued that fighting the United States, their primary source of grain, was economic suicide. Consequently, the bluster was ignored, and the border was quietly extended along the 49th parallel, ending the crisis with a stroke of a pen rather than the roar of a cannon. However, the most absurd and potentially catastrophic test of this fragile peace arrived in 1859 on the tiny, disputed San Juan Island. The conflict began in a potato patch. An American farmer, enraged to find a Hudson's Bay Company pig rooting through his garden, shot the animal dead. When British authorities threatened to arrest the farmer, the local American military commander, General William Harney, a man known for his hatred of the British, escalated the squabble into an international incident. Harney landed infantry and artillery on the island, daring the British to evict them. The Royal Navy responded in force. 5 British warships, bristling with heavy guns, anchored off the coast, training their sights on the unparalleled American camp. The order to engage was expected at any moment. The fate of 2 empires rested on the shoulders of British Rear Admiral Robert Baines. Arriving on the scene, Baines was handed orders that authorized him to land Marines and drive the Americans off. But as he surveyed the absurd scene, cannons primed over a dead pig, Baines made a decision that likely saved thousands of lives. He refused to fire. He famously reported to his superiors that he would not involve two great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig. His refusal to pull the trigger froze the situation long enough for Washington and London to hear of the madness and hastily negotiate a joint occupation. Once again, the art of the near miss had prevailed, relying on the sanity of a single commander to hold back the tide of war. If the pig war was a farce, the crisis that followed 2 years later was a tragedy waiting to happen. By 1861, the United States was tearing itself apart in the Civil War. Britain watched the conflict with a mix of horror and opportunistic calculation, officially neutral but economically tied to the South's cotton. The atmosphere was thick with paranoia. The Union blockade of southern ports was strangling the textile mills of Lancashire, and every Union naval manoeuvre was scrutinised by the British Admiralty. It was in this powder keg of tension that Captain Charles Wilkes of the USS San Jacinto lit a match that nearly incinerated the Atlantic Alliance. On a cold November day in the Bahama Channel, Wilkes spotted the British mail packet RMS Trent. Acting on intelligence that two Confederate envoys, James Mason and John Slidell, were aboard, Wilkes fired a shot across the British ship's bow. He boarded the vessel, a sovereign piece of British territory, and seized the diplomats at bayonet point. In the northern states, Wilkes was instantly hailed as a hero, feted with banquets and parades for twisting the British lion's tail. But in London, the news arrived like a thunderclap. The seizure was a flagrant violation of maritime law and a direct insult to the Union Jack. The British public exploded in outrage. War fever swept through the press, with editorials demanding that the Yankee upstarts be taught a lesson. At the helm of the British government was Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, a man whose foreign policy was often defined by the aggressive use of gunboats. Palmerston was incandescent with rage. In a cabinet meeting that has since become legend, he reportedly threw his hat onto the table and roared to the American ambassador that while he might stand for many things, he would be damned if he stood for this. The gears of the British war machine began to turn. An ultimatum was drafted, demanding the immediate release of the prisoners and a full apology. Simultaneously, 11,000 British combat troops were ordered to board transports for Canada, ready to open a second front that would almost certainly have doomed the American Union. The draft of the ultimatum was harsh, bristling with the kind of language that leaves a nation no room to back down without losing face. Had it been sent as written, Lincoln would have been forced to choose between national humiliation and a war he could not win. However, the fate of the two nations came to rest in the trembling hands of a dying man. Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria, was gravely ill with typhoid fever. He was weak, his mind clouded by fever, yet he remained the diligent guardian of state affairs. When the belligerent dispatch was brought to his bedside at Windsor Castle, Albert recognized the catastrophe it invited. Summoning his last reserves of strength, he took his pen and began to edit. He softened the tone, removing the accusations of malice. Crucially, he reframed the incident, suggesting that the British government believed Captain Wilkes must have acted without instructions and that the United States would surely wish to correct this unfortunate misunderstanding once it was brought to their attention. This was a diplomatic masterstroke. Albert had built Lincoln a golden bridge, a path to retreat with honor. By receiving the edited dispatch, Lincoln was not being bullied into submission. He was being given an opportunity to disavow a rogue captain. In Washington, the president faced immense pressure from a public that wanted war with Britain, but he saw the strategic reality clearly. "One war at a time," he famously remarked to his cabinet. Accepting the lifeline Prince Albert had thrown, the Lincoln administration released Mason and Slidell, citing that Wilkes had indeed acted without orders. The crisis passed. The British troops in Canada stood down, and the Confederate diplomats sailed for Europe, where they would ultimately fail to gain recognition. It was a victory of restraint, secured by the dying act of a prince who prioritized peace over pride. The resolution of the Trent affair was a triumph of individual decision-making, but the enduring peace that followed was not merely the result of luck or the intervention of dying princes. It was anchored in the cold, hard realities of economics and grand strategy. As the Civil War dragged on, a complex web of interdependence began to harden, trapping both Great Britain and the United States in a situation where war became prohibitively expensive for both. The Confederate States of America had gambled their existence on a single economic theory: King Cotton. Southern strategists believed that the British textile industry, the engine of the Victorian economy, was so dependent on Southern cotton that London would be forced to intervene militarily to break the Union blockade. Initially, this fear seemed well-founded. Mills in Lancashire began to close, and workers went hungry as the supply of raw cotton dried up. But the Confederates had failed to account for a new monarch rising in the north: King Corn. In the early 1860s, while the American South was burning, Europe was shivering. A series of disastrous harvest failures swept across the continent and the British Isles. Britain faced a food security crisis of existential proportions. At this precise moment, the American North was enjoying bumper crops of wheat and corn. The trade balance shifted dramatically. British imports of American grain skyrocketed. The government in London faced a stark choice. They could fight for cotton and risk starvation, or they could remain neutral and secure the bread needed to feed their restless, industrial working class. In the end, bread proved more potent than thread. The economic shackles binding the British stomach to the American Midwest proved stronger than the aristocratic sympathies for the southern planter class. Beyond the grain silos, a grim military calculus also kept the swords sheathed. British war planners, sitting in the Horse Guards in London, looked at the map of North America with growing trepidation. They knew the Royal Navy remained supreme. In the event of war, they could blockade American ports, bombard coastal cities like Boston and New York, and sweep American commerce from the oceans. But they also knew that the United States had transformed into a military juggernaut. By 1863, the Union Army was one of the largest and most battle-hardened forces on the planet. Canada was the hostage in this strategic standoff. British generals realized that while they could burn American cities from the sea, they could not stop the Union Army from marching north. A war would almost certainly result in the American conquest of Montreal, Toronto, and Quebec before reinforcements could even cross the Atlantic. It was a 19th century form of mutually assured destruction. Britain could destroy the American economy, but the United States could erase the British Empire from North America. This vulnerability forced a policy of caution. British leaders like Lord Palmerston, for all their bluster, understood that the cost of defending Canada against a fully mobilized United States was a price the empire could not afford to pay. This era also marked the quiet rise of professional diplomacy, a stark contrast to the amateur shouting matches of previous decades. Men like Lord Lyons, the British ambassador to Washington during the Civil War, exemplified this shift. Lyons was a bachelor workaholic who maintained a stoic silence amidst the chaos. When the American public clamored for war, and when the British press screamed for blood, Lyons kept his channels of communication open and his emotions in check. He famously instructed his staff to pack their bags during the height of the Trent crisis, not to panic them, but to show the Americans he was serious, all while privately urging caution to his superiors in London. It was this new breed of diplomat, men who prioritized long-term stability over short-term jingoism, who greased the wheels of de-escalation. They recognized that the two English-speaking powers were drifting toward a shared future, one where their strategic interests would align rather than collide. As the smoke cleared from the American Civil War and the 19th century began its long descent toward the 20th, the dynamic between London and Washington underwent a profound metamorphosis. The era of the Great Rapprochement had arrived. This was not a sudden embrace born of sentimentality, but a strategic realignment driven by the changing tides of global power. By the 1890s, the British Empire, though still at its zenith, found itself uncomfortably isolated. The rise of a unified industrial Germany and an ambitious Japan threatened British hegemony in the Old World. The doctrine of splendid isolation, Britain's policy of avoiding permanent alliances, began to look less splendid and more dangerous. Britain needed a friend, and she looked west to the sleeping giant she had spent the last century antagonizing. The British government began to actively court the United States, treating the rising republic not as a rebellious colony, but as an equal and perhaps, eventually, a successor. This shift was tested in the Venezuelan crisis of 1895, where a boundary dispute in South America once again raised the spectre of war. In previous decades, Britain might have sent gunboats to enforce its will. Instead, facing an assertive American demand for arbitration based on the Monroe Doctrine, London blinked. The British government accepted American mediation, tacitly acknowledging the United States as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. It was a calculated retreat, a sacrifice of regional pride to secure a global partner. The physical manifestation of this new diplomacy was the border itself. The frontier that had once bristled with forts, militia patrols and warships was gradually demilitarized. The fortifications rotted away, the cannons were melted down, and the garrisons were withdrawn. In their place rose monuments like the Peace Arch, straddling the boundary between Washington State and British Columbia, inscribed with the words, "Children of a Common Mother." The 49th parallel became the longest undefended border in the world, a testament to the success of Victorian conflict resolution. It stood as proof that two heavily armed expansionist powers could live side by side without a constant threat of violence, provided they had the wisdom to prioritize trade and dialogue over territory and honor. This century of peace was not merely a footnote in history. It laid the bedrock for the modern world order. The special relationship that would later defeat fascism and containment communism was not forged on the battlefields of World War I, but in the quiet, smoke-filled rooms of the Victorian era. It was built by men like Webster and Ashburton, Prince Albert and Lord Lyons, figures who understood the immense value of the off-ramp. They recognized that in the high-stakes poker game of geopolitics, the greatest victory is often the one that allows your opponent to fold their hand with dignity. Today, as the world navigates a new era of multipolar tension, the lessons of Victorian diplomacy resonate with urgent clarity. The Pig War and the Trent Affair teach us that great conflicts often arise from small absurdities, and that the machinery of war, once started, is terrifyingly difficult to stop. But they also teach us that war is a choice, not a destiny. The Anglo-American peace was preserved because, time and again, leaders on both sides of the Atlantic chose to absorb a short-term blow to their pride in exchange for long-term stability. They understood that national honor is a poor substitute for national survival. The peace that held between Britain and America was a triumph of patience over passion. It proved that diplomacy is not just the art of the deal, but the art of the delay. The ability to slow down the rush to judgment, to create space for cooler heads, and to find the golden bridge that allows an adversary to retreat. As we look back on this era of near misses and calculated restraint, we are reminded that the most successful wars in history are the ones that were never fought. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Victorian Cold War that almost was, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments, do you think modern diplomats could learn a thing or two from Prince Albert's Golden Bridge strategy? We'll see you in the next brief.